Hey, what's up you guys? I'm Sara Lubratt, and in today's video, we are talking all about editing, revising, and knowing when you're done with your book. This is episode 5 in a 5-part series. If you missed any of the first 4, I highly recommend going back and watching those. We've talked about pretty much everything you need to know in order to write a book in 2025. We've talked about brainstorming and outlining. We've talked about starting to write a book. We've talked about what to do when you feel stuck in the middle of the book or when you get writer's block. We've talked about how to write a satisfying ending. And today we're talking about what to do with the book once you've done all of those other 4 steps, which is my favorite part of the writing process. Editing. If you go on to enjoy this video, I'd really appreciate it if you could give it a big thumbs up because that really supports my channel by telling the YouTube algorithm that you liked my video and that somebody else might too. And now without further ado, let's get into the video. There's a statistic that in the United States, about 82, it might be 84% of people say they have a book idea, but only a few of those actually start writing. And if you are actually able to finish writing a book and get to the step where you get to revise and edit and fine tune your story idea into something that other people could read, then you have reached the very, very, very small percentile. To start off this episode, I'm going to remind you guys of a quote that I have up here on my writing motivation board. It's a quote by Shannon Hale that says, "I'm writing a first draft and reminding myself that I'm simply shoveling sand into a box so that later I can build castles." Editing is the building castles part of the process. If you have gotten this far and you have a completed rough draft, now through editing and revising, you get to turn that rough draft into what the story looks like in your head. I am just gonna put it out there that finishing the rough draft is the hardest part. It is really hard to show up, especially on days where you're not feeling it. We talked a little bit in an earlier episode of showing up for your writing even when your inspiration is not there, even when your motivation's not there, because building discipline will be there for you more than inspiration ever will. And we've talked a little bit about building self-confidence in continuing to show up for your writing, even on days where you're not really feeling it. But something that will influence your self-confidence the most is finishing something. Once you finish a rough draft and you know that you can, your brain will know that you can do it again, which is the beauty of writing and where people really get hooked. So now let's talk about editing. This might be something you don't want to hear, but I would highly recommend not trying to fix everything in one editing pass. So we're going to break out the different drafts that I think somebody should have and what to work on in each of those drafts. Before you go through and make your first editing pass, a lot of published authors recommend taking a break. Most people say at least a week, some people say 10 days, some people say a month or 2, but you want to let the story rest so that when you get to your first editing pass and you reread your story, you can read it with fresher eyes. The first editing pass I recommend doing is zooming out and looking at the big picture. This is when you mostly want to be focusing on plot and character, mostly on the consistency and how the character arcs build throughout the story, how the plot builds throughout the story, making sure that all of the plot points are satisfying and make sense, that all of the characters are acting in accordance with their motivations, so that one of the characters isn't doing one thing and in the next chapter they're doing something completely different. As far as reading for characters and character arcs go, you want to make sure that you're looking at your character's motivations and fears and your character's development and overall character arcs. Do your characters experience growth in a way that feels satisfying and realistic? And are your characters consistent throughout the book? Do they talk the same way throughout the book? Do they use the same language throughout the book? Do they use consistent mannerisms throughout the book? You just want to make sure that your characters are consistent with who they are. And in order to zoom out and not focus on line editing, which is grammar and spelling and phrasing, which can be a very fun part of editing, but that you kind of want to avoid for this draft because you might be changing some bigger picture things and you wouldn't want to get like 3 paragraphs perfect if you are eventually going to have to cut them anyways because they no longer line up with the story. So in order to avoid the line editing, I recommend printing out your story so that you can't be making tweaks on your computer as you go. There's also something so incredibly satisfying about holding a book that you've written in your hands. What I'm holding in my hands right now is draft 1 of my high fantasy series that I call Project DE. This was draft 1 of book 1. This story came quite a long ways throughout the many drafts that I did on this first book, but once you have it and you can hold it, you will be much less inclined to make line edits while you are working on editing plot and character arcs, especially because instead of writing on that printed manuscript, you can have your printed out pages sitting next to a notebook where you are making notes of edits that you want to make for plot and character, because again, that's the 2 things that we're focusing on in this first editing pass as you read the story. So as you work on reading your printed out manuscript, you can be making notes on things that you like about the plot and character arcs, things you want to change, ideas that you're coming up with as you're rereading the story, and over overall things you want to change or improve. Again, focusing on the bigger picture things as opposed to line editing or phrasing. And the beauty of printing out your manuscript and writing down notes in a notebook is so that you can read the whole thing before you start making changes. Because you wouldn't want to start reading chapter 1 and be like, oh, I need to change this and this, and I need to throw this in here, when you actually have already included it later on. So for continuity's sake, it's important to read the whole manuscript and take notes on the entire story before you start making the big picture changes. The whole gist of this pass is just to zoom out and get a big picture view, because you don't want to make things harder on yourself by starting to change something in chapter 1 when in reality you've already mentioned it later on. Another thing you might want to look for in this first editing pass is making sure that every chapter contributes to the plot, or character development, or in some way achieves something beneficial to the story. This might be a little bit painful, but I believe it's Stephen King that says, kill your darlings. If it is not relevant to the story in any way, shape, or form, it might need to get cut. And yes, that hurts, but when you need to start cutting things, you can always just start a new document that says like deleted scenes or something, where you can copy and paste those deleted scenes over into a new document so that you are not losing them. And maybe you could recycle them and use them later on in the story or for a different story, but you might need to kill your darlings and cut things out. I also highly recommend saving every new draft as a different file name so that you can always go back and look at your previous drafts if you end up cutting something out and then you want it back later on. We don't want to lose our writing, which is also a great time for me to say back up your work. Email it to a trusted friend, put it on a hard drive, put it in Google Docs if you are writing on Microsoft Word. Have multiple places for your books to be. I have lost 22,000 words when my computer accidentally restarted and something wasn't backed up. Back up your work, you don't want to lose your progress. After you've gone through and made these changes for the first editing pass, I recommend putting that story away, whether it's for another week, another 10 days, another couple of months. You can start working on the next thing while you shelf this book for its predetermined waiting period. Depending on how you're feeling about the story after the first editing pass, this might be when you want to send it to some beta readers. Beta readers are people that you trust with reading your story and giving you productive feedback. You don't want to send your book to somebody that's just going to be like, yeah, it was really good, because that doesn't actually help you improve the story or know what was actually good other than, they liked it, which is not beneficial feedback. You want to find beta readers, and that's beta readers plural, that you trust, that have the ability to get their feedback back to you in a certain amount of time. The reason that you want to send to multiple beta readers is that some people might say that they have time to read your story, but life happens. They might not get all the way through your book. So it's important to have more than one beta reader so that at least one of your beta readers reads the entire story. When I sent out my high fantasy book that I call Project DE out to my beta readers after draft 3, which is when it made sense for me, I sent the book to 5 beta readers. 2 of them never started it, 2 of them didn't finish it, and only 1 of them did. So obviously the 2 people that never started it were not able to give me any kind of feedback. The 2 people that stopped reading were at least able to tell me where they stopped reading and kind of why. One of them had to stop because she had too much family stuff going on, and I was like, that's totally fair. The other one lost interest in the story, and that was really beneficial information to get back, because then I knew where exactly I needed to work on the story in order to improve it to keep readers in the story. And then of course the beta reader that actually finished the book was the most beneficial, because I could ask her where she stopped it after reading it the first night, what she thought of the different characters, what she thought of their motivations, what she thought of their plot lines. She did not find the original ending of the story to be very interesting, and that took me a very long time to figure out how to fix, but I finally did, which is partially why my book took 7 drafts. And I think I'm able to give this advice because now that I've gone through 7 drafts of a book, I know what I would do differently in my approach to outlining, writing a first draft, finishing a first draft, and then editing in fewer passes. So let's say you send your book out to beta readers after your first editing pass so that you can get outside feedback on those bigger picture things. You can also send your beta readers a questionnaire sheet, which is typically about 10 to 15 questions. And that can include things like what they thought of a certain plot point or plot twist, a certain character's decision, where they put down the story every time they stopped reading, what they thought of the ending, and their overall thoughts of the story. There are lots of beta reader questions online that you can send to people, but it helps give your beta reader a little bit of a direction if you can ask them some slightly more pointed questions instead of what'd you think? Which is then when you might get the not helpful feedback of, it was good, I liked it. It can also be very helpful to give your beta readers a time frame to get the story back to you. I believe I gave my beta readers like a month or a month and a half. The book was pretty hefty. I think it was like 130,000 words when I sent it to beta readers the first time. I also did a second round of beta readers when I was working on draft 7 to help me cut out some words, which was very helpful, but that was truly about word count and what needed to stay in the story as opposed to overall character motivation and plot. So the beauty of sending your book out to beta readers is that you can be working on something else during that time. And because it's so highly recommended to let your story rest between drafts, the month or month and a half or however long you choose to give your beta readers to read your story counts as your break because you're not looking at the book while they're reading. And then when that beta reading window closes and you get their feedback, you can then begin draft 3, which is the second editing pass. This can involve going over beta reader feedback and changing anything that beta readers suggest if it resonates with you as the author. Because somebody might say that they don't like something, but you really do. So it might be worth asking a beta reader more questions about what they didn't like or what they did like about a certain scene or section. And if they suggest something that doesn't sit well with you, you don't have to change it. But odds are that somewhere in your beta reader feedback, you will find something that you think is beneficial to the story. So now that you have your beta reader feedback and you've incorporated that, we can now edit for flow, structure, and pacing. Here might be a good time to shuffle some things around. Something that I had to do after getting beta reader feedback was change the layout of some of my chapters. Because Project DE is written from 3 points of view, sometimes I had to take one person's POV chapter that was down here and put it up above this other POV chapter, just because that's what made more sense as a reader. So you might want to ask yourself the question, are the chapters in the right order? And then when we start talking about pacing, you can start asking yourself the questions of, does the pacing for this scene or chapter make sense? If you are writing a fight scene, for example, you might want to shorten the sentences a little bit so that the scene can feel punchier, no pun intended. Or if there are any longer lulls in the story where you were either losing beta readers or losing your own interest in the story, you might want to cut those portions down. You can also ask yourself if there are any sections where just like too much is happening that you might need to slow down or space out a little bit. And then once again, after you've made those changes, the story goes back on the shelf for another couple weeks, another month or two, and then we can start what is hopefully the last draft, which is proofreading or line editing. This is basically the polishing draft where you can be changing phrasing, looking for awkward or clunky sentences to either rephrase or streamline, looking for typos and comma placements, looking at dialogue to make sure that your dialogue is realistic and not clunky. And a tip for editing dialogue is to read the dialogue out loud, because reading dialogue can often be very different than spoken dialogue. So it can be helpful to read dialogue out loud to yourself in order to help yourself clean up some of that dialogue. And the last thing that you can be working on in this draft is tightening your prose and cutting out the words that just don't need to be there. I noticed when I was doing this that I was cutting out so many like 3 and 4 word phrases, and I would have the phrase in the castle like multiple times on a page, and just going through and focusing on at sentence level what could be deleted saved me so much on word count. Because in rereading the story and tightening my prose, which is what draft 7 was all about, I realized as I was going that the reader would know where the character is. I don't need to remind them every third paragraph that the character's in the castle, because that's obviously where they are. And then by the end of this third editing pass, your proofreading pass, your 4th draft, your story might be done. There's a chance you'll need like another draft to just like go through it again, just make sure that everything is as you want it. But those 3 passes should accomplish the gist of what editing needs to do for the story. And every editing pass gets that sand in a box a little bit closer to being a castle. I want you to be kind to yourself in this process and remember that progress is progress. Writing a book is a huge freaking deal. Finishing a book is a huge freaking deal. I'm so proud of you. I hope that you're proud of yourself. And that brings us to the end of this 5-episode series. Thank you guys so much for watching these videos. I really appreciate it. I had so much fun making this series. I hope you guys found it beneficial. Let me know what your favorite part was down in the comments below. Please like and subscribe if you have not already. That really supports my channel. I'm Sara Lubratt. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you guys in the next video. Bye.